speakers. Our chair today is Katrina Crowe, Head of Special Projects in the National Archive, and I'd like to give her a big welcome.
It's wonderful to see so many people here on a rainy Sunday morning when the bed would beckon with great attractions. And I think there's going to be a fly past this morning, which seems a bit bizarre with those gale force winds happening. Anyway, that's going to be going on when we get out of here after our very interesting session. The session this morning is Women in the Labour Movement since 1913. And we have three very distinguished speakers to talk about that topic. Now, an extraordinary thing happened in the last 2 weeks in Dublin, which is that a bridge was named after a woman, and not just a woman, but a Labour activist, Rosie Hackett, who had been almost forgotten for very many years, and then began to be resurrected first by Margaret McCartan. And I remember when she first mentioned Rosie, and we all realised what an extraordinary amount of work needed to be done to excavate her memory. It is fantastic that she won that competition, and that we have a bridge named after her. And I'm sure that many of you here played a part in ensuring that was the outcome. Now, there's something else going on at the moment I just want to alert you all to, which is, I don't know if any of you saw the tenement experience in Henrietta Street over the 6 weeks of the summer, which was funded by the trade union movement as part of the 1913 commemorations. And it was staged by Anu Productions, Louise Lowe, who's a girl from the north of the city, from Hardwick Street, a good friend of mine. And what you got was 40 minutes of the experience of what it was like to live in a tenement house in 1913 and what the issues were that were facing people then. Extreme poverty, dreadful living conditions, and of course the huge debate, which wasn't just a public debate but also a private debate about the lockout and what should happen there. Everyone who saw it was stunned by it, moved by it, will never forget it. Their latest outing is a set of events called 13, and there is a point to what I'm saying here, where they're staging 13 separate events across the city over the period of the Fringe Festival. All of those 13 events relate to the 1913 lockout, but also to today, in the same way as our discussion will try to make connections between what happened then and what's happening now, and what needs to happen in the future, which of course is the very pressing question facing us all. One of the segments deals with Rosie Hackett in Liberty Hall, dealing out soup to people who come into the place, talking to Larkin, talking to P.T. Daly, who's another character who's been resurrected, if you like, as part of this dramatic event. And what they do, we get Rosie in her contemporary costume, describing how she walked out of Jacobs, and she says it started with a simple no. I wanted to wear my badge, they told me to take it off. I said no. And she then goes on to describe what happened. But then they reinvent her as a modern young hairdresser today, who's just lost her job in one of the many hairdressers that have closed down due to the recession. And her question is, what if I said no? So what you're getting is a constant connection between the activism of a woman back in 1913 who was a very young girl at the time. She was 17 years old when she walked out of Jacobs Biscuit Factory, where the National Archives coincidentally is based now. I feel her ghost floating around every now and again. We actually have the wages books for Jacobs in those years, and we can see that the day that Rosie walked out with her comrades, because they get no wages for the weeks following. Her comrades do, but she doesn't, right? And the people who walked out with her. So it's very alive and very, very much still there. And today there are many potential Rosie Hacketts who, and some of them very active in the trade union movement, attempting to better conditions for themselves, and not just their sisters but their brothers too, because we're much more gendered now than we were back then. And I suppose I'm saying all this to you just to say that there are connections between, very serious connections, between what happened 100 years ago and where we find ourselves now. We still have serious poverty. We still do not have what was fought for in 1913, the right to free collective bargaining. Now there's hope that a bill that will go through the law might give us something like that, but I have my doubts that it will go as far as we would wish. So there are pressing questions facing the trade union movement in general, how to reinvent itself, how to make it attractive to younger people, which is a very serious question, and also how women fit into it, get served by it, serve it back, join it, regard it as something that matters to them, particularly as women. So this morning we're going to have a look at some of those questions, and we're going to start with Therese Moriarty, who I've known for very many years. She's an eminent labour historian. She's contributed many, many pieces to SAHER, which is the journal of the Irish Labour History Society, of which we're both members. She speaks regularly at events, particularly dealing with women in the trade union movement. And this morning she's going to talk to us about the historical experience of women in the union movement, just to set, if you like, the scene for us for the later discussion. Please welcome Therese Moriarty.
Okay, thanks very much. The historical experience of women in the union movement was proposed to me as a title to explore women's hopes, aspirations and disappointments, some of the general issues over the century and how these might have been prefigured between 1913 and 21. So in 20 minutes, that's a bit of a mad dash along history's timeline, so I'm going to be making quite a lot of leaps, probably chasms lie behind it, and hopefully it won't be too overstretched. But anyway, 1900s, right, women's presence in Ireland's trade unions was registered not in numbers, these were still very small, but within new structures. Different strategies and different unions were framing a new space for women members. Women's unions, women's committees, women's branches, women's reserve seats on executives were all different approaches that were taken by the Irish trade union movement 100 years ago to meet the challenge from women workers across industries and employment throughout the country. Women factory workers especially, already used to taking industrial action, began to expect more stable organisations. From 1910, their angry and noisy disputes led them to the offices of young, energetic industrial movement, represented in Ireland especially, was at the headquarters of Liberty Hall in Dublin. In Belfast and its neighbourhood, the industrial heartland of Ireland, the same enthusiasms had led 20 years earlier to the launch of trade unionism for women with the 1893 the Textile Operative Society of Ireland. Though not an exclusively women's union, it was launched with the express intention of bringing in the tens of thousands of strong linen workforce of women into the trade union movement of that city. This movement of women workers was tracked by legislation, among these the Factory and Workshops Act, which brought commercial laws, laundries under state regulation, Trades Boards Acts, which were designed to counter the three features of women's exploited labour, known as, which they knew as sweated labour: low pay, long hours and very poor working conditions. The Shop Acts of 1912 promised new freedoms to the army of drapers' assistants throughout the towns and cities. The monthly journal of Mandate's forerunner, the Irish Drapers' Assistants Association, printed one member's account of how she greeted her first day of their half-day holiday that came with the Shops Act. And this is how she wrote: "Today, thought I, as I dressed quickly for business, when the appointed hour strikes, the grey clouds of work shall split asunder, and we shall see freedom standing against the azure floating beyond, joyfully beckoning us onto sun-washed streets, away to laughter-haunted glens, down the coast to where the foam-flecked waves break in sweet symphonies on golden strands." So that appointed hour was due to start at 1:30. They would also, one day a week, they would also have a daily dinner break for the first time of 45 minutes and a half hour off for tea in the afternoon. Local authorities regulated and enforced these new working hours. So across Ireland, their union organised members' excursions and outings for the great big day of 1912, which was the first half-day holiday. And their general secretary remembered when they had first kind of announced that they would campaign for such a half-day off a week, they were all dismissed as simply dreamers. So these were auspicious times for audacious women who stepped out onto new territory, explored vivid and urgent identities, and claimed far more public and political visibility. Elizabeth Matten, president of the Irish National Teachers' Organisation in 1912, told Hannah Sheehy Skeffington that her ambition was to be a Labour MP in a Home Rule Parliament. Before they had trade unions, women of course organised their activism around shared needs in their neighbourhoods based on their long history of industrial and community militancy, as they had demonstrated as well during the lockout. During those years, there was also a flowering of distinctly socialist or collective culture in some districts. There was cooperative retail organisations, socialist Sunday schools, bicycle clubs, reading rooms, extended socialist and labour organising into working class neighbourhoods. Liberty Hall, which opened in 1912, had begun a busy programme of social, cultural activities by and for Irish Transport and Women Workers' Union members and their families. Women's organisations and groups sprang into life in these years. Irish political parties acknowledged their commitments and energies in a series of auxiliary or complementary organisations. The Nationalist Party Women was formed an organisation in 1910, Unionist Women in 1912, Cumann na mBan, of course, in 1914. Women's public gatherings, once had been rare or unknown, were now becoming very familiar. Women stood on platforms to speak, others gathered round them at street meetings or in large assembly halls. They wrote newspaper columns and feature articles in their own press. They attended in small delegations substantial public meetings where there might often be the only women to plead their cause. They joined cultural and social political associations like the Independent Labour Party of Ireland of 1912, where men and women activists debated and campaigned together. The optimism of these early years, powered by anticipation of Home Rule, was played out against darker prospects. Emigration, of course, was enormous, and the largest group of people that left Ireland was always young women, and of course around them they were leaving deserted villages and the ruinous towns and cities at that time. Most women workers, trade unionists or not, were to be found outside of trade union meeting halls and offices, and only a fraction of the workforce were in any trade unions. Most of women worked beyond the scope of trade unions. According to Mona Hearn, the historian of domestic service, manufacturing was only surpassed the amount of domestic service in 1911 in that census. Women made up about a third of workers, and that figure would really remain constant until quite recent times. In the aftermath of the Dublin lockout, as 1914 dawned, the territory of the Irish trade union movement appeared relatively healthy. The Irish Trade Union Congress registered 110,000 members of affiliated unions, but a keener look shows a rather more barren prospect for women workers. There was a retreat across the territory. The bold steps by a quite conventional trade union movement that had elected a woman onto its executive in 1906, and which was repeated in 1910 when she was elected as the ITUC vice chairperson. In 1912, the ITUC delegates voted off Mary Galway, the secretary of the Textile Operative Society, in favour of more radical candidates, all of whom were men. A unique pioneering episode of Irish trade unionism ended then. Ireland had a trade union movement that had been prepared to elect a woman to such national prominence that no other trade union movement anywhere else had done. Neither the US nor the British trade union movement, both of them much older than the Irish trade union movement, wouldn't elect any women to their executives until some years later. Mary Galway affiliated her union with the ITUC in 1913, but along with her colleagues from the Belfast Trades Council, none of them attended, and her union never came back. They stopped attending the Belfast Trades Council in the same year. So women linen workers had lost their earliest and foremost and formidable champion from the meeting halls of organised labour. In Dublin, the exhausted energies of the Irish Transport were spent in argument and division, much of it centring on the Irish Women Workers' Union and their official Delia Larkin. After months of picketing and supporting Liberty Hall's work through the lockout, the Women Workers' Union was effectively eclipsed. In 1914, the union lost its core industrial base in Jacob's Biscuit Factory, which Katrina talked about earlier, when the company flouted any understanding about reinstating the young women who had walked out of their jobs and been locked out. The young women were humiliated and subject to intrusive and pointless medicals. Lost the page here. My old hands kind of separated. The Shirtmakers Co-op on Eden Quay substituted from 1914 for much of the union's activity in Dublin, which was a struggle for retrenchment and survival. War would alter the course of events for everyone, and women's work was every bit as affected by the disruption of war as men's employment was. Short time was introduced across a range of industries, and though this protected workers from dismissal, it had a devastating impact on people who received low wages, especially women workers. Demands for supplies, I mean, there would be maybe 2 days a week was all the work that they would be getting at the beginning. But gradually demands for supplies began to assert military needs above civilian necessity and wartime mobilisation. Irish women's industries in textiles, clothing and food were all strategic for the war effort, and across the country industrial wartime controls were introduced to govern all those industries. Intended to halt the pre-war confrontation between labour and capital, as struggles like the 1913 lockout had been often described. Compulsory arbitration was brought in, but in fact and would then go on to encourage trade unionism, despite the fears of workers that this was a form of industrial conscription. What happened was that compulsory arbitration insisted that employer and union sat down together with state-appointed officials, and this was a breakthrough in many industries where unions had often just been completely ignored and refused to meet with the unions. One of the first forays of the reorganised Women Workers' Union was to Williams and Woods in the autumn of 1915. A wages board had been set up that comprised of the employers, workers and state representatives for the Irish food processing industry at the same time. The struggle for munitions factories that the Nationalist Party fought particularly intensely brought a new British trade union to Ireland, which was the National Federation of Women Workers. They came to Ireland to organise in the shell factories because they wanted the pay and conditions that they'd won in to be upheld in the new shell factories in Ireland. Only 5% of those workforces were allowed to be men, so you can see that this was a huge kind of industrialisation of women workers. It built strong branches in Cork, Dublin, Galway and Waterford, where the shell factories were, but also around them in Wexford as well, and to some extent in Belfast, where there were private companies engaged in shell work. And around them, the Federation began new branches in the woolen clothing industry in particular, and appointed Irish organisers. The Federation members not only joined the unions, but of course engaged with the culture of the unions. So on May Day 1918, they headed many a May Day procession. In 1919, the Federation members marched in May Day parades in Dublin, Cork, Galway, Waterford, Wexford, and I think in Derry, where they also had new branches. And they left that year, in 1919. They said they had only come in to organise for the munitions work and during the wartime, and they transferred all their branches and members and their organiser, Margaret Buckley, to the Irish Women Workers' Union. Of course, at this time as well, 1918, the Irish Transport and General Workers' Union began to admit women, and if you look at the minutes of the Women Workers' Union, you can see some of the conflict that was growing up. The Women Workers' Union had now registered in 1918 as an independent body, and they felt very much that the Transport Union was coming in and taking their members, and there were attractions for people to go into the bigger and more mixed union. As the war ended, the changes wrought in women's trade unionism were most visible at the annual central stage of the Irish labour movement. So instead of the 2 or 3 women delegates that had been attending since its formation, the numbers began to increase. In 1918, 9 women, who were still a minority in 240 delegates in the hall, but now represented not just the Women Workers' Union, but the Tailor and Tailoresses' Union. The Irish National Teachers' Organisation had joined up with the National Trade Union movement, and they also not only were sending 3 women, but also nominated and were successful in winning a seat on the executive for one of their members, Rose Timmins, and the first woman since Mary Galway lost her seat to sit on the executive. And she held that seat till 1921. That year, both Helena Maloney from the Women Workers and Cissy Cahalan, the Shop Workers' Union, were elected to the executive as well. These names alone point to the way that women from different political movements had forged alliances around the issues of working women. But they also suggest the divergence of the political and industrial wings at that time. As the Irish Labour Party was named and formed, first as the ITUC, an Irish Labour Party in 1914, reversing this organisational framework to becoming the Irish Labour Party and TUC a few years later, it was not simply the momentous events of war, recruitment, rebellion, revolution that would so drastically limit Labour's political potential in the coming years. By driving its foundations deeply into the trade union structures so that the Labour Party members had to be in a trade union, political Labour built in a privileged and enclosed affiliation where whatever the benign aspiration was designed, if you like, to leave thousands of women and men outside its ranks. Not only was Labour divided about whether to contest the 1918 election, it was unable to draw on the newly released energies of the enfranchised young women and young men of 1918. Even when the ITUC executive considered standing candidates, the party couldn't agree to endorse that most loyal of their members, Louis Bennett. Many of the men and women, once declared sympathisers with Labour, began to drift towards Sinn Féin or the Communist Party, unable to recognise the place for independent Labour in these immediate years. The first woman Labour councillor, in fact, was Margaret McCoubrey, who won the won the Docks ward on the Belfast City Council in 1920. And in the Irish Free State, Mary Johnson won a seat as Labour's first woman councillor in Rathmines in 1925. Many of the women's structures that brought women into trade unionism around this time were then swept away, and most of them were kind of got rid of in the names of equality. Women had appeared in public, they had taken all the different stands, and therefore, in the name of equality, why have women's structures? So it would take another 50 years before anything like these could be reinstated again. In the 1970s, they began again to kind of consider some of the issues about working women. And, but of course, for many of the unions, for a long part of their history, they talked about the problems faced by working women as the child care, access to work, equal pay. But for many unions throughout all history, the biggest problem about women was women themselves. And the solutions to their problems were invariably, all too frequently, laid at the door of women and not at the movement itself. Mary MacArthur kind of also described a Gordian knot, if you like, of kind of women in trade unionism. Mary MacArthur was the head of the National Federation of Women Workers. She said that the main issues of women's work arise from the fact that women are unorganised because they are badly paid and poorly paid because they are unorganised. And that kind of remains as one of the continued themes, I suppose, and issues of the last 100 years. And certainly until people began to sort of look again in our own time to some of the structures and some of the directions that unions were taken. I'm not sure whether this rather partial account has addressed my brief, but I hope maybe in looking back at the experience of women in the trade union movement, one of the really most consistent themes is fighting for getting. So thank you for listening.
Women are fantastic for sticking to time. Grace was perfectly on her 20 minutes, and I know that's going to be followed up. I'd love to be able to say the same about our male colleagues, but it's not always the case. Anyway, take a lesson from us how to be efficient. That was a fabulous roundup of the early days of women in the labour movement. And I want to thank Therese, as she always does. She gives us a very comprehensive grounding in where it all started. We're now going to zoom ahead into the era of the EU. But I just want to show you one little story about what was happening in between, which was, of course, quite a serious amount of opposition from male trade unionists to their female members. I was a member of Impact, but before that the Union of Professional and Technical Civil Servants. I worked in the civil service. And we were vastly outnumbered, women to men, in the union. But we would try every year in the 1980s to get a motion passed to have a women's committee. How threatening could that be? Every year it was turned down. So we just set up an informal women's committee and did the stuff anyway. But one year we get up and we make our speech, and there's half-hearted lukewarm applause from the men. And a woman from the Met Office, who I will not name, who was part of our union, got up and said, "There's no need for women's committees, it's all grand. All that's over. We're finished." And behind me I hear, you know the guy who winks on the weather? who was also in the union, saying, "Good man yourself, Teresa." And I thought, oh, Mother of God, we have a long way to go. Anyway, there is now a great women's committee in fact, and all the other unions, and there's the women's committee ICTU, which is hugely influential and important. But we've come a long way, and I hope we might get a chance, perhaps, to look at some of the things that happened after independence, before we get to the moment we're coming to now, maybe in questions and comments afterwards, because it's a very important period. Okay, the EU is often credited with giving women many, many things that we would never have got from the national government. I think that is certainly true up to a point. Equal pay would obviously be the one that sticks out, where they were dragged kicking and screaming from wanting to have derogations from this into being forced to actually pass the legislation. Our next speaker is going to address that interesting question of how the EU has affected for better or ill working women in Ireland, and she is Louise O'Reilly, who is the education sector organiser with SIPTU. And we must remember our next two speakers are active trade union officials who are women. Not an easy time to be that these days, or to be any kind of a trade union official, male or female. So they deserve our admiration for sticking to their last through these difficult times. Louise.
Good afternoon. The EU and working women. It's a fairly broad subject. It could lead us down several roads, many of which would involve speculation and a bit of what-ifery about Ireland's membership of the European Union. We could reasonably ask ourselves, why is it that we as a nation seem to accept without question the assertion that the EU has given us so many rights? In the case of women, we are told that we should be grateful to the EU for the granting of equality legislation, which is underpinned by European Court of Justice rulings. And maybe there is some truth in this. Maybe it's also true to say that membership of the EU has placed a limit on the capacity of women to achieve true equality in the area of work. Equally, it is true to say that as a trade unionist, I see grave dangers in the granting of rights and the manner in which this is done by the EU when it is viewed as a remote and somehow benign benefactor. Workers, women workers included, own those rights for which they have fought. They have a sense of that ownership and they understand those rights. Rights which are simply granted and not won are less owned. And this is an issue for women when we consider that the lawmakers are traditionally men. So we have those rights which they have granted, but who knows then what rights we could have won in a struggle. I was very fortunate to grow up in a household where Desmond Greaves was regularly spoken about and his writings often quoted. And this is one of the reasons why I was so very pleased to accept the invitation to talk here today. I grew up knowing that in Greaves's writings you could find a quotation for any and every eventuality. His warning over the dangers that the European Union and the common market could serve to erode our national identity and thereby create a platform for the far right, who have their own notions about national identity, are worth noting when we consider the position of women, migrants and any other marginalised grouping within the European Union. He warned us that the EU was essentially a project which was designed for advancing the interests of big business, and he wasn't wrong. Because there is no doubt that a common market makes movement of goods and money easier, and this is a benefit to international business because they can go where wages are cheap to manufacture and they can move their money around to ensure that it only lands wherever the tax regime is favourable. I suppose when we say that, we're mentioning the double Irish and all of that other stuff that we're hearing about recently. Workers can't do that. A worker on a modest income is limited in where they can shop. They don't have the facility of moving their money around to avail of a more advantageous taxation system. So when Greaves told us that nationalism is dangerous and unwelcome to the powers that be in the era of transnational capital and the common market, he could foresee the potential negative impact of the suppression of our national sovereignty. He could see that the interests of big business are served when we set aside our national identity and all gather behind one flag, one currency, one set of rules and laws. His fears that this would create a vacuum which could be filled by far-right rhetoric and hatred were well-founded, and there is no doubt a danger in subsuming our national identity. And so, why is there so much enthusiasm among Irish feminists for the European Union? Why is this seen as such a positive force in the lives of Irish women? In order to understand this, we need to go back to 1973. On the day when Desmond Greaves was celebrating his 60th birthday, the exact day as it goes, my parents were welcoming their first child into the world, and Ireland had just joined the EEC. My mother had recently left her job in the civil service, which she was not allowed to hold after marriage, and their daughter was born into an Ireland which was different in many ways from the Ireland that we're living in now. The Catholic Church held a position of power and a virtual stranglehold on working class communities. According to a survey carried out in 1973-74 on behalf of the Catholic Church, over 90% of Irish people went to Mass on a weekly basis. The same survey found that 71% of those surveyed believed that sex before marriage was always wrong, a figure which had reduced to 6% by 2003. There you go. According to the Irish Left Review, legislation was passed or defeated on the whims of Catholic interests. Social norms and conventions were passed down from the pulpit to the worshippers in the pews, and most shamefully, thousands of Irish women and children were forced into what was essentially slave labour. So that was Ireland in 1973, in which there were just under 288,000 women working, representing a mere 27% of the workforce. 30 years later, that figure had risen to 42%. This can be attributed to a number of factors, including the benefits brought by EU membership. But it's also true to say that the nature of work has changed since 1973. Traditional industries have declined, and we have seen a growth in sectors which were relatively small in 1973. By 2003, the numbers employed in the services sector had risen from under half a million to over 1.2 million. So in 1973, the young O'Reilly child would have been born with limited prospects of finding work. And if she met a nice man when she was older, no need to find work anyway. The church was a formidable force in Ireland in the 70s, and with a small percentage of female workers, it can reasonably be argued that we needed the intervention of a powerful force to face down the church. And there's no doubt that politicians, fearful of what was known as a belt of the crozier, could have found some solace in declaring that Europe was imposing this equality legislation on Ireland. I am the second generation of working mothers in my family, and in 1973 when I was born, it was by no means the norm for women to work. But my mother left her job in the civil service when she married, and she took up employment in the private sector. From then until now, we see that female participation in the workforce has increased, and it's easy to draw a straight line from this to the introduction of equality legislation, which underpins the concept of equal pay for work of equal value, and measures such as paid maternity leave. It's also easy to understand that promoting equality by using the Equal Status and other acts has had a dramatic impact on the levels of female participation in the workforce. There's no doubt that there's a considerable weight of evidence to support the notion that Irish women have been among those who have benefited the most from our membership of the European Union. Irish women's participation has increased from 27% to 42% of the workforce today. However, the true measure of the value of the European Union and the common market for women is how it reacts in a crisis. In an increasingly neoliberal climate, the struggle for all workers is becoming harder. And as James Connolly said, the worker is the slave of capitalist society, and the female worker is the slave of that slave. Therefore, as we deal with the recession, is it impacting equally on men and women? Or are Irish women bearing the brunt of cutbacks and austerity? So what has membership of the EU actually brought for Irish women? How have these benefits manifested themselves? What impediments exist within the EU to support or hinder advancement of working women today? And have these measures served to spread the burden of austerity or to shield women workers from it? It's hard now to imagine having to leave work on marriage. It's almost impossible for us to envisage a society without the influence of the EU Equal Pay Directive or the EU Equal Treatment Directive. Both of these have served Irish women well, and the work done by lawyers and activists such as Mary Robinson on the transposition of these directives into law has meant the removal of the marriage bar, the introduction of paid maternity leave, the introduction of the Equal Pay and Equal Status Acts, the Maternity Leave Protection Act, which protects women workers from dismissal for being pregnant, equality in the Social Welfare Code, equal access to vocational and other forms of education. So 40 years after joining the EEC, what is life like for Irish women working in the EU? Certainly we have maternity leave, which is among the highest in Europe. We have legislation which underpins our right to equal pay for equal work, and yet we still have the gender pay gap, which is narrowing, but it's narrowing while we are all getting poorer. So according to the synthesis report published by the European Commission in 2012, when the available evidence is examined, we can see that the narrowing of the gender pay gap has 3 contributory factors. Wage components of pay packets. Typically, men earn more or higher bonuses than women, and these are being reduced significantly, while basic pay for both genders is being reduced at the same rate. Sectoral segregation. This means that unemployment and wage reductions are being hardest felt in male-dominated sectors, such as construction. And lastly, equal pay policies. However, there is no clear indication that would allow us to separate out the actual part that equal pay policies play in the narrowing of the gender pay gap. Ireland was the first EU country to declare itself officially in recession in August 2008, and the second country to have a structural adjustment programme imposed by the IMF, ECB, EU Troika. And so we've looked at what happened to women working in Ireland in the 30 years following our joining the EEC. How would all this equality legislation and the transposition of directives protect women from the ravages of the crisis? According to Ursula Barry and Pauline Conroy, in The Untold Story of the Crisis, women in Ireland have fared far worse than men in this economic crisis. They point out that the measures imposed on Irish people and directly attributable to the bailout from a gender equality perspective have an unacknowledged yet significant negative impact. And as we are struggling under the weight of the measures imposed on us by this crisis, and to some extent by the EU, we see that the advances made by women in the labour market may have been little more than window dressing. We see that while female participation in the workforce has increased overall, there are wide variations across sectors. Barry and Conroy say there is a highly segregated labour market now. Women account for over 60% of those employed as personal service and sales workers, and only just over 5% of those employed as craft and related trade workers. A little over 16% of those employed as plant and machine operatives, and only around 1/3 of those employed as managers and administrators. This tells us a story about those rights which we were granted, and perhaps speaks volumes about those rights which we need to fight for. Women are overrepresented in those areas where trade union density is traditionally low. In the services sector, for example, this is reflected in their terms and conditions of employment and the precarious nature of work in that sector. If you are an Irish woman in work today, you are 3 times more likely to be working part-time than your male counterpart. This is lucky, to a certain extent, because one of the effects of the bailout has been to see a contraction of service provision, such as home health services. There has been no consequent contraction in the need for those services, however, and someone has to be providing them. Women in part-time employment very often have to combine their work with a combination of caring and child-rearing responsibilities. This is another way that the crisis has impacted on female workers in the European Union. In 1973, Irish women would have shouldered the lion's share of the caring and child-rearing responsibilities. In modern Ireland, she's still doing that, but now she's fitting it in around her part-time job. And as I said at the beginning, the topic of women working in the EU is a very broad one. I've presented some data which I have to thank Dr. Ursula Barry most sincerely for. It's clear that there were immediate benefits to Irish women on joining the EU, but the real measure of the protections available are those which serve to shield us from the worst impact of the crisis. I'm not suggesting that feminists and campaigners in the 1970s were necessarily wrong. In fact, I think they were right to look to Europe as a place where they could start the fight for equality. However, I think that it is true to say that while we must continue this fight, we need to be aware that Europe has changed. We have seen that the rights granted to us by membership of the common market have limited value in protecting women from the ravages of the crisis. And so it's time to look at where we can best exercise our power and to where we have the best chance of winning those rights which will serve to offer real and lasting equality. We have to continue this struggle here in Ireland, and we have to recognise that Greaves was right when he said that big business fears nationalism more than socialism. Reclaiming our national sovereignty will see us reclaiming the power to win in real battles for working women. Much has changed since the 70s. The EU has changed since the 1970s and has become dominated by right-wing neoliberal powers. This doesn't mean that we give up, but it does mean that we must work to change the nature of the EU so that it works for working people and not for big business. And more importantly, we must work to make our own country one which has protections in place which will ensure equality for our women workers and for all working people. And the best way to do that is to join a union and get active in your union. Thank you.
Those who were active in feminist campaigns in the 1970s had every reason to be very grateful for the then very different EU, as Louise has pointed out to us, to what it is now. But I suppose something that's hopeful about that is that it can change again, and one hopes it will. I heard from a lady sitting behind me earlier that she thinks, unfortunately, that Mrs. Merkel is going to win the election again on the 22nd of September, which is going to cause trouble, but she also says it won't make that much difference compared to the opposition. It's really, prevailing ideologies always have effects, but one of the distinctions we have to draw is between prevailing ideologies, particularly economic ones, which at the moment are savage and in favour of the rich, and established legal and legislative structures that give people rights that can be defended. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. I want to thank Louise for a very comprehensive look at how things have changed and moved for better and for worse since we joined the EU and what's going on there. And that brings us very neatly to our final speaker, Fionnuala Ní Bhrógáin, who is an organiser for the Communications Workers Union. And this, I suppose, is one of the most crucial areas we have to face today, is organising and recruiting people into the trade union movement. How can we go about doing that in a way that makes them understand that, as well as being organisations that look for improvements in pay and conditions, they are also one of the great civic organisations we've got left. And they are democratically owned by their members. I met somebody recently who said to me, those trade union leaders are paid far too much by the taxpayer. And I said, what? The members pay the leaders. If they pay them too much, they decide to do that, but it's a democratic decision taken by the members of the trade unions. Couldn't get it, thought this was being handed down from the government. So the image needs to change. We need to brighten up the image of what is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the essential pillars of a democratic society, a strong trade union movement. So Fionnuala, I hope, is going to enlighten us about some of the ways that young women might be recruited and organised into the trade union movement now. Fionnuala.
Good morning, nearly afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's a great pleasure to speak to you on a subject very close to my heart. I've been working as a full-time union organiser for over 4 years in the Communication Workers Union, a relatively small union representing workers in the postal and telecom sectors. I'd like to address the issue of women in the workplace in Ireland in the current economic and political climate. I'd like to do this in the context of trade union organising, and we'll try to cover some of the challenges that are still ahead. Since around the beginning of the 20th century, women have succeeded in winning many rights at the legal and political levels to varying degrees, depending on where they live in the world. However, despite all the equality legislation and the organisations, nationally and internationally, dealing with women's rights, there is still a great gap in equality between men and women. Women in Ireland still receive 15% less pay for the same work, are more at risk of poverty, and are concentrated in low-paid and part-time work with little job security and poor pension rights and social welfare entitlements. In Ireland today, this is borne out by an ESRI report which states that one of the reasons for the wage gap between men and women is the increasing wage inequality between the highest and lowest income groups in recent years. As Louise has already covered, in 2009 the National Women's Council of Ireland reported that women are responsible for 86% of child supervision, 82% of care of adults and 80% of cooking. The study also found that women comprise 70% of people in their 30s who are full-time carers in the home for adults with long-term illnesses or disabilities. Being a full-time carer during working age years deprives women of the opportunity to earn wages and provide for their pensions. Women who are excluded from the workforce because of their care duties are also excluded from the social insurance system and consequently have much lower pension entitlements. The report went on to say that more than 80% of male pensioners are entitled to a state pension based on social insurance entitlements, but less than 60% of women are entitled to the same pension. This pension gap means that women are more likely to live in poverty in old age. The extent to which these figures have changed due to the recession and austerity policies remains to be seen, though the recently released Oxfam report does not bode well for austerity measures and their impact on inequality and poverty. It is argued that part-time work and flexible working hours meet the needs of women in the workplace, enabling a so-called work-life balance. This is difficult to realise, however, when women remain the primary carers and reliant upon inadequate and increasingly privatised childcare. This unresolved problem of publicly funded childcare and caring services mean that 77% of part-time EU workers are women who are often excluded from full-time, better paid employment opportunities. Women constitute the largest proportion of low-paid workers, concentrated in the service industries and call centres, retail, cleaning, hotels and tourism. Rural women working on farms have no recognition of their work and its contribution to the economy. At the recent Excellent Tenement Experience, a sign quoting Edward Gibson, from former Attorney General, read, "It is a terrible indictment of our social existence that the resources for getting a livelihood open to women are so few. At present, the language practically held by modern society to destitute women may be resolved into marry, stitch, die, or worse." Sad to say that the same could almost be said of today's society more than 100 years on. Until we bring women into the workforce and ensure that they get jobs that end the stereotyping of women in low-paid work, addressing the true reasons for this inequality, women will be prevented from assuming their places as full, equal participants in society. There are some steps which I suggest would go some way toward addressing these issues. With the provision of state childcare facilities, working class women would be released from their traditional role as the primary caregiver in the family. I specify working class women because this would have less impact on middle class or wealthier women, as they are in the position of being able to purchase private childcare, allowing them the freedom to choose to work. The impact of class on women must be recognised, as in many cases a low-paid woman will have more in common with a low-paid man than a middle class or wealthy woman. By increasing the number of professional carers for home care of the elderly, disabled and people with long-term illness, women would be in a position to return to paid work. Increasing maternity and paternity paid leave periods would have the obvious result of preventing the tragic situation of low-paid women and men not being able to afford to have children, should they choose to do so. It would also go some way towards addressing the assumption that the onus of early childcare rests with women. Ensuring that women may leave and return to the workforce without loss of pension rights and social welfare benefits would have an enormous impact on women who choose to have children or are in a position of caring. This could be addressed by doing away with the means test for the carers allowance, retrospective contributory pension credits for homemakers and carers, and individual social welfare entitlements for women. Ireland has become an increasingly diverse society, and migrant women contribute economically, socially and culturally as active participants in the labour market and through family and community activity. However, migrant women are overrepresented in low-skilled, low-paid jobs, often without trade union representation. The result is that many face some of the most serious problems of social exclusion and marginalisation, and are further discriminated against in the workplace as they face a range of gender-specific issues, and in the community as many women face exploitation, disadvantage and racism. These key issues require a collective response, and therefore organising migrant women workers into trade unions is crucial to challenging inequality, particularly in non-unionised areas of employment where the potential for exploitation is greater. Trade unions need to work within progressive movements and lead the fight for equal working conditions, working hours and pay for work of equal value for migrant and non-migrant workers. Protection and support, however, need to go much further than just within the workplace. This must extend to the wider community, society and globally. This will require a challenge to a wide range of issues, from the need for greater access to information, to an end to the trafficking of women, the powerful multi-billion sex industry and the promotion of prostitution. Inequality does not automatically disappear when legislation is enacted, and it requires the active participation of those concerned in order to raise the consciousness needed to move forward. While my role as an organiser in the communications industry officially focuses on both the telecoms and postal sector, in reality this largely means the call centre industry. The vast majority of workers in this area are women, frequently non-Irish and generally young. Having worked myself in a unionised call centre for many years, it came as quite a shock to me the level of exploitation I see every day in non-unionised call centres. My colleagues in IN Aircom had frequently moaned about how badly we were being treated, but it wasn't until I came into contact with workers without a union structure in place that I realised just how fortunate we had been. Call centres and contact centres are a large and growing source of employment in Ireland, and the industry is an obvious source of insecure and part-time labour. The vast majority of those employed in this sector are on fixed-term or agency contracts. Call centres are now offering 11-month fixed-term contracts or less to quite brazenly avoid the protection afforded by the Unfair Dismissals Act, which in most cases can only be invoked after 12 months service. Added to this is the fiction of probation, which barely exists in Irish employment law but is being used in practically every call centre in the country to increase even further the feeling of vulnerability. Workers are being bombarded from every side with what is essentially the truth, that they have very little legal protection from abuse. Employers and government are becoming increasingly creative in their efforts to weaken workers' rights. The recent introduction of the JobBridge internship scheme has opened up enormous potential for exploitation. The JobBridge scheme depresses genuine job creation by providing a pool of free labour to employers and inevitably creates downward pressure on wage levels across all sectors of the economy. The lack of oversight and clear, transparent policies in advance of any placement leads to inevitable employer abuse of the scheme. With the admitted goal of using the JobBridge programme to reduce numbers on the live register, the government has a clear motivation to maximise the number of placements, rather than effectively preventing inappropriate internships or sanctioning employers who abuse the scheme. The JobBridge programme supplants genuine jobs with a scheme where it is accepted that employers need not pay for their labour and no guarantee exists for qualifications or work on completion of a placement. It is commonly misunderstood that employers are securing interns for only €50 a week. This is not so. This €50 comes from the Department of Social Protection. The employer, if they can be called that, pays absolutely nothing. As it stands, the state now has a policy of subsidising private capital from public funds. From an organising context, this scheme has the added disadvantage of creating a huge section of the workforce who are unlikely to join a trade union, leaving workers even more vulnerable to exploitation and undermining trade union density in those workplaces. This damage to trade union strength will further destabilise the labour standards that have been long fought for. Women working under these unsure and vulnerable circumstances obviously have a fear of drawing attention to themselves. When a worker asks me, "Can I be fired for joining?" the answer isn't that simple. It is technically illegal, but while it is possible to take a case against an employer for dismissing someone on the grounds of trade union membership, these are nearly impossible to win. Even if it was certain that you would win, the process takes approximately 2 years and the member is still out of work. This is a risk many are unprepared to take. Frequently, even if they are made aware that they are being taken advantage of, they are too nervous to do anything about it. I come across time and again women who are too afraid to be seen to make any kind of stand. Where previously in Ireland collective bargaining and union recognition were somewhat taken for granted, we are now facing employers with absolutely no intention of allowing either. This is absolutely crucial. With Ireland being a voluntary system, legislation does not oblige any employer to engage with a union, regardless of how many members have joined. The result is a unique employment law model where Ireland has the least well-protected union rights in the whole of Europe. This system allows employers the right to refuse to engage with their employees on even the most basic of levels. Companies can legally refuse to participate in the industrial relations machinery of the state, and even when they do participate, they can choose to ignore the recommendations of the Labour Court. In fact, cases that are being taken at the moment are setting the precedent where companies can argue that the Labour Court has no jurisdiction to impose any kind of industrial relations model whatsoever. It is in this atmosphere that workers in Ireland are struggling not only to improve their conditions, but also struggle to retain protections that have been fought for by previous generations. It's important to note that this exemption for employers is in contravention of several international treaties which Ireland is a party to, not least the European Convention on Human Rights. And yet employers themselves show that they see the value of collective action by having a union of their own, IBEC. In May of this year, the Supreme Court issued a decision regarding registered employment agreements that will have far-reaching implications for hundreds of thousands of workers in Ireland. This Supreme Court decision is the latest in the dismantling of these vital protections for some of the most vulnerable and low-paid workers in the state, and represents a massive shift in the way in which employment standards are negotiated in this country. New hires in the affected sectors will not be afforded the protections that were previously available and will have to rely on minimum wage legislation. This is another step in the race to the bottom for wages in Ireland and will have an impact far beyond just those workers directly affected. These centralised wage setting mechanisms that existed under these agreements also created an atmosphere of industrial peace. Due to this finding, the Labour Court will no longer be able to enforce minimum wages and terms in the affected sectors. This will lead to more local bargaining and lower wages for workers who are already in some of the sectors worst affected by the recession. This ruling marks a significant attack on workers' rights and the ability of their trade unions to bargain collectively on their behalf. In a country where workers and their unions do not have a legal right to collective bargaining, the decision to dismantle the ability to set sector-wide agreements is particularly disquieting. It is worth noting that some unions, including my own and SIPTU, have recognised the futility of trying to make gains within the hostile legal system and have realised the value of returning to traditional trade union values of activism and agitation. By abandoning the failed partnership model and recognising the core principle of mobilising the workers themselves, some positive steps are already being taken. Finally, on the subject of collective bargaining, our Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore was expected to speak at the recent ICTU conference in Belfast, and it had been anticipated that some announcement would be made around provisions for collective bargaining legislation as promised in the programme for government. Only a cynic would suggest that his sudden need to excuse himself and attend a meeting in Brussels is a convenient way to avoid answering this long-standing question. Added to this, the current economic climate has led to many unscrupulous employers taking advantage of the lack of knowledge of their employees, of their rights and entitlements in the workplace. From personal experience, there is nothing quite like talking to a 22-year-old about their employment rights to highlight the extent of ignorance there is about what is and what isn't permitted in the workplace. This underlines a long overdue need for children in this state to be taught their entitlements while still in school. If all school leavers were fully informed of their employment rights, there would be considerably fewer instances of abuse of those rights. Women constitute half the working population, and women's membership of trade unions is rising. It was recently revealed that for the first time in the history of the state, there are more women trade union members than men, now at 53% of membership. However, they remain underrepresented in proportion to their numbers. The barriers that prevent women's full inclusion in the general workforce are not absent simply because that employer is a trade union. You could in fact argue that on top of the other obstacles, unions offer more. Anyone who has ever been to a branch meeting or conference will know the huge time commitment required to progress in a union. The old stalwart of negotiating meetings going through the night in smoke-filled rooms can be an enormous barrier to the woman with a family, not to mention the networking over a few pints into the early hours in pubs across the country. Until we reach a stage where family and caring commitments are equally shared between women and men, unions will need to rethink their way of doing things if they want to put their money where their mouth is regarding proportional representation. Based on conversations I've had with Irish and non-Irish women living and working here, the belief amongst them is if the trade union movement is looking to truly represent the shape of its current membership, it will have to politicise itself and campaign government to remove the social barriers that exclude women from participation. Until we address the true reasons for a lack of participation, women will be prevented from enjoying the benefits of leading in the direction that represents their needs. We must continue to demand full-time permanent employment with shorter working hours and proper wages and pensions, to resist the raising of the pension age, and to demand the public childcare services that would make this possible for women and for men. It always amazes me how many people, women included, who laugh at the idea that we haven't already liberated from the home or from cultural stereotypes. Many believe that the battle is long over. Young people, and particularly young women, are bombarded on a daily basis with the promotion of an aspirational lifestyle that lauds individualism and material goods. While no one would argue that women aren't entitled to make an effort to look good, my concern is that it seems women are being persuaded to believe that emancipation is achieved by buying shoes. What I see as the Sex and the City version of feminism seems to have been easily accepted as the modern way. There seems to be a deliberate ploy to put it about that we've moved on, and any doubt expressed is seen as being very old-fashioned and can be met with ridicule. For me, this is only one step away from the concept that a woman's happiness is secured by securing a husband. Couple this dream lifestyle of shopping and travel in the context of increasing poverty with the astonishing number of ads for cleaning and childcare products that feature only women, and it's easy to understand why young women today are confused about their role in society. Women must learn from their history to recognise that only through solidarity and collectivism can great changes be achieved. Thank you.
Our contributors have stuck like glue to the instructions for their timing. Again, draw your attention to that female capacity. We have quite a lot of time for comments and questions. We've got about half an hour.